Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Monet, you've looked at a couple of tax referendums. Give us the stories of those.
Sure. Well, one of the ones that's going to be voted on this November is Measure 118 in Oregon, which would impose a 3% tax on the gross receipts of all corporations operating in the state. So usually taxes on corporations apply to their income, that is their profit. But in this case, it's on the gross receipts. So essentially it's going to apply to all of the sales of large companies, and it applies to sales above $25 million. So 3% might sound like a small number, but the Tax Foundation has done an analysis that shows the impact that it would actually have on a lot of businesses operating in that state. If you took, for example, a company that had $50 million in sales, which is by no means a huge figure, and had a 7% profit margin on that, they would essentially be paying about 43% of their profit to the state of Oregon if this tax is approved by voters. And so it's one of those ones where the language on the ballot is not going to necessarily make it look so threatening, but it would have a really, really harsh impact on all businesses operating in that state. And usually you would see Democrats getting behind a potential huge revenue raiser of this kind, but Oregon's Democratic Governor Tina Kotek and most of the Democrats in the legislature have come out against this ballot measure. And the reason for that is it's not going to raise any revenue for things like education, social services, the usual things that taxes of this kind are created to fund. It would only create a dedicated fund to give rebates to Oregon voters. So essentially, all of the revenue that's raised by this tax would be divvied up among all the residents of the state of Oregon and then paid out in checks. And the ballot measure was pushed by a resident actually of California who says that he is a proponent of universal basic income. So essentially, he wants to create a model experiment of creating a subsidy for everyone, regardless of their income level, to receive an automatic check in the state of Oregon. And there are lots of other outside donors who are contributing to this because they want it to be the first experiment in creating a statewide universal basic income. The good news is that Oregon voters had a similar ballot measure just a couple of years ago that was roundly defeated by almost a 10-point margin. And so it seems like they're not going to fall for the trick this time around. But I think a lot of the business groups in the state are getting together to try to advertise against it and make sure people know how much damage it could potentially do to Oregon's economy. And another tax measure on the ballot in a neighboring state, Washington, has to do with a recently imposed capital gains tax. So Washington is an interesting case because they have a constitutional provision that bans an income tax. So unlike the vast majority of states, they don't directly tax income. And that's always frustrated Democrats in the state, again, because they want every opportunity to be able to raise money to fund social services, education, what have you. They eventually passed this capital gains tax by labeling it as an excise tax. So the idea was that we're not actually taxing the income that our residents make from selling their assets. We're just taxing the sale of the asset itself, the transaction. And that's a fairly ridiculous argument because generally excise taxes are defined as taxes on a specific type of transaction to offset the cost of that transaction. So you might pay an excise tax when you register a vehicle because the state needs to collect money to be able to pay for improvements and maintenance in the roads. But generally, an excise tax would not apply to a broad range of transactions the way that a capital gains tax was. So this one would apply whether you're selling stocks or selling a painting or selling just about anything other than real estate. Nonetheless, the state Supreme Court of Washington upheld it. And the idea was that it was going to be a big revenue raiser, but one of the immediate effects has been that it has actually chased away a lot of the high earners in the state who were there in part because they wanted to be in a place that was free of an income tax. The most famous example of this, of course, is Jeff Bezos, who a lot of listeners might recall moved from Seattle to Miami in 2023. It's estimated that he saved $600 million by moving from Washington Washington to Florida because Florida has no income tax at all. And he's not alone. There have been lots of other high net worth individuals who have decided to escape this tax. And so the amount of revenue that it's collecting hasn't been nearly as close to what the legislators who backed it hoped it would be. That's another one that's created a lot of dissatisfaction among Washington voters. And it's very likely that they might choose to repeal that capital gains tax in November.
Let's do one more. This is Amendment 2 in Kentucky. And Monet, Kentucky has been an outlier as many states that are red or red-leaning have been expanding school choice and charter schools. What's the story with this?
Well, we've seen a lot of states around the country expand school choice, either by providing more opportunity for charter schools to be created. These are public schools that use an independent charter and are able to avoid unionization and include some better techniques for teaching students, or by creating ways to help use state tax dollars to help fund people who want to pursue a private education for their children. And that can come from scholarships that are tax funded or from vouchers. In Kentucky, a fairly conservative state, the legislature has wanted to do this for a long time, but they've been hamstrung by a provision in their constitution that bans state education dollars from going to anything other than common schools. And so they did pass a law in 2021 that would have created a scholarship fund for students to be able to attend private schools, but that ended up being struck down by the state Supreme Court because of that constitutional provision. And the same story with charter schools. They don't have charters because of that requirement that only common schools can get those dollars. And so there now is on the ballot a provision that would amend the state constitution to create an allowance for these things. And it's much needed in the state because all of the billions of dollars that are being spent on their traditional public schools haven't produced particularly good results. We've seen that fewer than half of students in Kentucky at the 4th and 8th grade levels are able to pass reading and math exams every year. They've more than doubled their education funding since the early 1990s. And those are the results that they're getting. And so I think a lot of parents in the state have children who are stuck in really underperforming schools and want to say there shouldn't be an archaic provision in our constitution that's preventing us from potentially getting some reform here. So I think there's a good chance that that one will pass as well, and Kentucky will be able to join other states that have moved in the school choice direction over the course of the past couple of years.
Thank you, Monet and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.